Hey everyone, this is Amanda Eke, host of the Poet Speaks podcast. Welcome to season 5. I talk to poets from all over the world engaged in spoken word, slam poetry, and oral traditions. And we were named as one of Strategic Media Inc.'s top 5 podcasts by Black creators in February of 2022. Tune in weekly to listen to me and poets talk about performing, oral tradition, and most importantly, they tell me why they need to get their words out. And guess what? If you or your organization wants to be a guest or a sponsor of our podcast, let us know and message us on Instagram and Facebook at the Poet Speaks Podcast. Enjoy. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Poet Speaks Podcast. Now, our next guest is a poet, educator, and activist based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. His work explores the relationship between narrative power and resistance, and he's performed everywhere from the United Nations to music festivals like Eaux Claires and Soundset to countless colleges, universities, as well as conferences. He's also been part of the 2 National Poetry Slam Championship teams, given a TEDx talk, and published 2 books via Button Poetry. My goodness, he's done so much. Please welcome to the podcast, Tran Myhre. Kyle, how are you?
All right. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. No, I'm a Minnesotan now. So it's nice to have a Minnesotan on the podcast.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. Were you born and raised in Minnesota, or are you kind of a transplant?
Yeah, so I've lived here. I think I lived in Minneapolis longer than I've lived anywhere else, but I'm not from here originally. I grew up in moved around a lot, but I was born in La Crosse, Wisconsin, which is right across the border, kind of like a smaller city in Wisconsin, and then lived in a few different places, went to school in Madison, Wisconsin, at UW-Madison, and then moved to Minneapolis in around 2007, something like that, and have lived here ever since. And so I think of it as home, but have lived in a few different places here in the Midwest.
Absolutely. So it's definitely home now. For you, you know what? Your name is very interesting. So like we said before we started, you now want to go by Kyle, but you've gone by a pen name, stage name. Tell us your stage name for the past, you said almost 15 years now, but now you're transferring out of that. Guante, correct?
Yeah, it's one of those stories that I wish was more interesting, but it's not really that interesting. Like I know, when I started getting into music stuff and poetry stuff, this was in the age of where most people had stage names, right? Especially coming from like a hip hop community of people, where it was just the normal thing to have a handle, a stage name. And like when I was in high school, I got the name Guante. It's just from playing basketball. It's just like a stupid sports nickname. I won't go into the whole story behind it, but it's Spanish for glove, right? And because a handful of people already called me that when I started making art, I just said I'll just use that as my name, and it's kind of stuck with me then for the last 10, 15 years, and it's fine. Like there's nothing wrong with it, but I like my actual name. I think Kyle Tran Myhre is a cool name, so I've been trying to like slowly transition into just going by my name.
Sure. Well, so they called you, so guante means glove. Were you like clutch on the court? Like what was
I think kind of like tongue in cheek, like because for the older listeners, there was the Seattle Supersonics player named Gary Payton, and Gary Payton went by the glove, right? I don't know if you're a basketball, but I'm not even that much of a basketball fan, but I remember very distinctly Gary Payton. And so I think it was more like I definitely wasn't that good or anything. It was more like just a tongue in cheek, just kind of a joke.
okay.
But when you're 16, your stupid little nickname will follow you around for the rest of your life, potentially, if you let it.
Oh yeah, once you start it, it just never goes away. Absolutely. I agree with that. Tell us a little bit about your childhood and background. Now you said Minneapolis, you weren't born and raised here, born and raised Wisconsin. So not only Madison, but also another part of Wisconsin. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing there and how did poetry finally kind of find you, if it did find you when you were that young?
Yeah, I like how you frame that question specifically, because I think a lot of the work that I do today is like with students, like whether at colleges with undergrads or in high schools with high schoolers or even middle schoolers sometimes. And like that question I think is important because I always like to share with students that when I was their age, I had poetry was not on my radar at all. Like creative writing was not really a thing that I thought I would do as a career or go into even as a super serious hobby. Like I just, I played football and I hung out with my friends and played basketball and like played video games and just did, kid stuff. And I think that I'm also very much an introvert, like a very shy, anxious, quiet person. And so like none of those ingredients generally mix together to make someone whose livelihood is to be a performance artist, you know? But I like to share that story with students because it goes to show that like to be a performer, whether you want to be a theater person or a music, like a singer, a rapper, a poet, anything like that, like you don't have to have a certain type of personality or like or just way of being. That this kind of work can be open to all of us in different ways. And I think for me, it was when I got to be more, around 18, I started, when I went to college, there were just more opportunities to do kind of open mic stuff and poetry slam stuff. And I think it probably, my recollection is a little unclear on it, but I think it probably started just on a complete whim, like just friends, relationships, like people dragging me to events. And at some point I got up on a stage for some reason and it just kind of clicked. Like it made sense for me personally as someone who's very introverted to be like, okay, I can get up on this stage and I can say what's on my mind, what's important to me, what I need to say, and then I can step back into myself again. And like that, it's easier for me to talk to 100 people from on stage than it is to like go to a party and have a conversation with another human being,
Yeah.
So I think a lot of that transition from like not really, maybe like writing, but not sharing with anyone, just like keeping it in a notebook under my bed, like that kind of writing life into being a performer and someone who's always like sharing my work, that it kind of just happened through happenstance. And I think very much through relationships, from having friends who were also writers or friends who would encourage me to go do the open mic or the poetry slam, that kind of thing.
Yeah, you know what? That's such an interesting point that you make. It's for you, it's easier to talk to 100 people on a stage than it is just in an intimate space like a party or like maybe you just walking in a coffee shop or like in a restaurant.
Or a
That's so
podcast interview. So,
or there you go, or a podcast interview. I wonder what do you think that kind of level of like I don't know, because it's definitely some levels of like, but you still describe yourself as an introvert because there's definitely some levels of, I don't know, there's definitely some levels of intimacy speaking to a crowd of 100 because, you're, especially something like poetry where you're really revealing a deep parts of yourself that would never come up in conversation. You know what I mean? That would be hard to kind of go into in a conversation with somebody. What do you think is that kind of mindset where it's easier for you to do that versus just one on one?
I think, but another thing that I talk about with students a lot is, I'll use a different example to go back to your question of like just performing, right? Like a lot of performance is projecting your voice and enunciating and putting some kind of emotional like energy into the piece, like trying to inhabit the poem. It's the whole idea of like performing something is different than reciting something. You have to kind of put yourself into it a little more. And what I talk about with students is that that is often, I think, the assumption is that is a natural talent people have. And I think maybe that's true for some people, but I know for me and for a lot of the other artists I know, like that's a learned skill. Like through rehearsal and through practice and through repetition, you can learn how to do all that stuff. And I feel like it's a similar process for what you were talking about with the idea of, again, being an introverted person and yet going up on a stage and telling a bunch of 100 strangers like my deepest, darkest secrets, like through poetry. I think that is also to some extent a learned skill. Like the more you do it, the more it just kind of makes sense, or like you develop your own rhythms, both in like a literal sense, like a rhythm of speaking, but also in I think a more deeper internal sense, a rhythm of like how you share pieces of yourself and how you make sense of that up in front of an audience. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, sure thing. No, no, I think that's a very kind of interesting thing to dissect. I myself, I feel similar in a lot of ways where yeah, it's sometimes easier to divulge to large groups as opposed to yeah, and I guess it's those reps. You get reps doing the same thing over and over again and practicing that skill. No, I'm happy that you tell students that are learning poetry all about that. Yeah. But moving on, your work focuses on some very interesting intersections, I think, narrative power and resistance. You write about men's roles and ending gender violence, which in itself is challenging a lot of dominant narratives. Also you delve into race and racism, which are very heavy, heavy topics. For you, what brought you to kind of center your writing and your work around these types of topics? Which, even though to maybe people like us, it's like, well, it's not that's just the everyday life. But to a lot of people listening, that may be like, whoa, those are some, that's a controversial. What brought you to centering your work around topics like this?
Yeah, again, I appreciate how you frame that in that
You're very welcome.
there's no like universal way of thinking about that. Like it's very much based on who we are and where we're from and the identities that we hold and all that kind of stuff about how much that is considered quote unquote controversial or quote unquote challenging. There's also the stereotype that poetry is all about like trees and heartbreak, which like it's perfectly cool to write about trees and heartbreak, but my work, like you said, has definitely moved more in the direction of writing about um to use like the language that a lot of people use today about like identity and privilege and power, but I think on that deeper level then becomes about narrative, like about the stories that we tell about the different identities that either we hold or we don't hold, the stories that we hear, how much those stories impact our action and like how we move through the world. And then I think at the end of all of that is this idea of power. Like where does power live in society, and like how do we push back against it? How do we navigate it? How do we hold it? All that kind of stuff. And I feel like again, all of that didn't come up because there was some point in my life where it's like, I'm going to write about, you know, men's roles in ending gender violence. And it was never that much of a just random spark of inspiration. It was all through relationships. I think another stereotype about artists in general, but especially poets, is that we're very kind of singular and like individualistic and like everything happens in our own heads. But for me, and I think again, for so many of the other writers that I know, so much of this work is about community and about relationships. And I think I got into writing about the particular topics that I write about because those are the things that I was talking about with my friends and my peers and the people who I was around. I got into writing and kind of activism and kind of the like social justice education, like critical pedagogy stuff all around the same time, when I was, again, 18, 19, 20, 21, in that kind of age range. And because all those things were happening around me at the same time, and I was involved in all of them in kind of different ways, they eventually have kind of synthesized into the work that I do today. But again, it was all just because of relationships. And I mean, I guess apart from that, like, that's a way to get into writing about those topics, but like, why continue to do it? And then for me, I think the answer to that question might be just about, this is a hard thing because I don't want to like put this on anyone else. I don't want to say that all artists should feel the responsibility to talk about blah, 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 or XYZ. But I know for me personally, as an individual, I feel like because I have a platform, that's all relative, but I have some kind of platform because I hold some privilege as a cisgender, straight, kind of white-ish, or at least white appearing, like people read me as white, man, that like it's important for me to talk about that stuff because it's important to contribute something to like the larger work of changing these big narratives. And again, I don't think it's on any one person to do that, but I think we can all contribute hopefully something unique or interesting to that larger conversation.
Sure. For you, what are kind of those, like you said, this is all based on for you, relationships and those personal experiences. How did those kind of manifest in your life what are some like specific anecdotes that you could give where those relationships led you to writing about this type of these topics?
Yeah, it's something I've thought about a lot because it's just interesting to think about our lives as kind of maps and how you go from point A to point B to point C. I think about how, when I was in undergrad and college, and a lot of what our conversation has gone back to those like formative years of when I was, 19, 20 at UW-Madison. But I think a specific contextual point there is that I was in college during the second Iraq War, right after 9/11, like 2002, 2003, when the US first invaded Afghanistan and then invaded Iraq. And like, there was a huge movement at the time. It was one of the biggest protest movements in the history of the world. And that was kind of my like jumping into the deep end of learning about activism, not in a big capital A activism sense, but in kind of a lowercase, like the nuts and bolts of going to meetings and learning how to facilitate meetings and learning how to promote things. And like, how do you throw an event that people actually come to? And like, how do you raise money to support that event? And like all those, the nuts and bolts of organizing. And I'm thinking about how that being involved in that work put me in touch with other people who were also involved in anti-war work, but their main thing was maybe gender violence prevention, like, or their main thing was supporting students of color at a predominantly white institution, or their main thing was something else. And I think making those relationships then just opened other doors for other opportunities. Learning how to move through that activist space became a tool that could be transferred to learning how to do kind of like social justice education work, like basic, if you have a group of 20 students and we want to have a deep conversation about, something as basic as like race and racism, poems became a way to actually like not so much do that work, but open a door to that work. And so like, again, just having people being in the right place at the right time, which is weird to say because it was like a very bad place and a very bad time, but being in that space and then using the tools that I had started to develop in other spaces to kind of, again, the word that keeps coming back to my head is synthesis. Yeah, I remember I had a mentor named Eric Mata, who's a poet and a kind of social justice educator. And he kind of brought me under his wing to help, it started with, helping to teach a course on social justice issues. And then I had another friend who, a group of us started like an alternative media, like an alternative student newspaper to the two primary student newspapers. And that was a way to, again, learn about how communication and narrative and story could help shift policy. And like, again, just all these little examples. I could probably ramble on about that for a long time.
Yeah. No, so it's so much of a deep-seated relationship that you have to the work, really so many ties and twists that kind of have unfolded to, the type of work that you do now. In terms of, you talk a lot about, you go back to, your time at college, you do a lot of teaching. Tell us about the kind of education you not only become an artist, but you become an artist educator. Tell us a little bit about how you've kind of found your way into that, teaching poetry now, teaching this art to other people.
Yeah, that's another funny thing because like it's a huge part of my life now. And then if I think back to like where that actually started, again, it was during that same time period. Again, through relationships, there was a local MC named Roberto Rivera in Madison at the time, who's still doing incredible work. I think I forget where he is now, but he's still doing incredible work. But he had just, a program using kind of hip hop, hip hop based pedagogy or like teaching philosophies, right? To work with different like youth groups, like middle schoolers and high schoolers. And because we knew each other just through the arts side of being MCs, being poets, that opened doors to do more of the education stuff. And so that was like my introduction into just kind of really basic like facilitation and like doing writing exercises and managing a group of young people. Like that, managing isn't the word, but like just being in space with people. And that, one thing, so much of, I think both an arts practice and an activist practice, something else I tell students a lot is about just showing up to one thing and seeing where that leads, like seeing what doors open from doing that one thing. And so from working with Roberto and like his group, that opened up different doors into learning more about kind of critical education and kind of collaborative, like liberatory educational practices. And so doing like the actual work to study, like how do you build a curriculum? How do you create a space where you're not just telling students what to do or telling them what to think, but hopefully co-creating the experience together. And then that, that opened up more doors to here in Minneapolis. I've worked with a few different organizations, I think specifically Compass, which is it's been around for like 100 years, but an organization that places teaching artists in schools all across the state of Minnesota. So it might do a residency at one high school for a week, and then might do a middle school like one day thing, and then do another school for a week, like throughout the year. And then another organization called True Art Speaks. The executive director is Tish Jones, and she really helped, built this organization that works around hip hop as, again, hip hop not just as a type of art, but as a deep cultural practice that also ties into spoken word. But then again, doing work with both in the schools and outside of the schools. They do like a monthly free all ages open mic. For years ran the Be Heard Minnesota Youth Poetry Slam series, which I would help kind of organize and like host some of the events and stuff like that. But they're still doing really incredible work too. But again, there's that whole idea of like one thing leads to another, and then you end up where you end up, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's pretty amazing. And if you yeah, it's like such a chain, a link of chains. You never know how one connection leads to the next. I'm so curious for you though. How important do you think it is? So many people do teaching art, they become teaching artists. How important do you think it is for the artist to teach? How important do you think it is for, maybe youth, not even just youth, but also, people of any age, they're trying to get into poetry, they're trying to get into whatever art form, specifically poetry. How important do you think it is for poets to actually be in these spaces? So much of it can become so, I want to almost say like commercialized because it's easier for some folks to get a grant that way. It's easier to have a teaching artist come to school to fill up curriculum. But how important do you think it is there? I do believe there's true value in just having an artist actually teach their art. How important for you is that?
Yeah, I mean, you touched on it a little bit just now, in that this isn't the main thing. I'll talk about the main thing, but there is some element of like, it's hard to make a living as a poet or other kind of artist. And so teaching and facilitation and residency work can be just like a different revenue stream, which I don't think is a bad thing. Like, I think it helps some artists, including myself to some extent. Like, I usually don't get booked just to like show up and read poems, right? Like, if I go to a college, it's usually, yeah, I'll share some poems, but then I'll facilitate conversations about the poems, and we'll do kind of deeper like dialogue work through that. And it's the same in high schools. Like, I might get booked to do like a week-long thing on creative writing or like introduction to poetry or whatever. But while doing that intro to poetry, we're also talking about these deeper questions of identity and privilege and power and agency and stuff like that. And so, one, again, yeah, it's a way that I can kind of make a living, right? Because there is sometimes the grant money, or the college has money to pay a teaching artist to come and do a thing. But I think, again, the larger question there that you're talking about is just I'm trying to frame it in my own head a little bit, but just like why that can be impactful, like why that's important. And I do think that I'm from a generation, I'm kind of like what's the word, when you're like kind of have one foot in the past and one foot in the present, in that when I was first started to do this kind of work, like it was in the days of like MySpace, right? So it was before YouTube and Twitter and TikTok and stuff. And I do think that informs how I think about this kind of work today, and that it is very much about legacy and mentorship and like passing on tools, passing on lessons, about doing the work of being a writer, like the work of developing your craft and blah, blah, blah. And like, whereas I do think, I don't want to project too much because I know everyone's different, but I do think there's maybe more of an attitude today that the quote unquote the work is just to throw some stuff up on the internet and like go viral and get famous. And like, we know that only works for a tiny, 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 tiny fraction of people. And so I think kind of going back to the basics of, the whole idea of like each one teach one, right? Like steel sharpens steel, like this idea of, again, mentorship and passing on the stuff that I learned from people like Eric, who I mentioned a minute ago, Eric Mata, and like other artists. Passing and continuing, use the chain imagery before, like continuing those links to keep going on. And I just think, I know I'm rambling a little bit here, but at the historical moment in which we find ourselves, right, particularly in this country, but in other countries too, like with rising authoritarianism and fascism, like it's just really important for people to have the tools to be able to tell their stories. I think it's really important for us to share those tools with each other so that we can all, tell a better story as a way to start working towards that reality. I think, creative writing and performance are really, really important tools in that process.
Absolutely. No, it's you had mentioned you're like you have one foot in the past but one foot in the future. So like I guess you would say you're like the middle child.
I mean, like, I'm sure it's probably partly true for everyone, but I'm thinking specifically about how we use the internet, right? Like when I was in high school, didn't have a cell phone, didn't really use the computer much at home, like didn't really have, it was like that dial-up internet thing. Whereas today, everything is, constantly online. And again, I don't think that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it does maybe inform how one approaches, like how we share our work, how we share our skills, how we think about all that kind of stuff.
You know, you had mentioned the idea, and I agree with you so much. The idea of getting famous online, it's such something that's marketed toward us so much, but the actual chances of that happening for you, the reality for most people is you're not gonna hit some virality in your life at all. Like it does happen quite a bit, but more often than not, it's not going to happen. And unfortunately for a lot of people, it's something that you kind of almost want to work towards. Now, for you, you know, so many poets, I'm sure they're listening to you as you're speaking, and they're like, how do you even manage that? You know, you're talking about because you know, hearing you talk about, hey, you know, I perform at this school, I do this conversation at this university, I educate here, I do this, do that. For you, if you could give any tips to folks out there that are poets and they're trying to become artists that are teaching artists, what is your advice for them to be able to step foot in that type of in that arena?
Yeah. Well, before I forget, at my website, I do try to share a ton of, like, not just my own work, but like resources and links and tools around these kinds of questions, especially for kind of aspiring or emerging poets. And I think that poets is a broad term that can also include potential teaching artists, potential like artist activists. So there's a ton of like links and resources and stuff at my website, which is just guante.info. But I think that's more specific question about if you are someone who, you have an arts practice, you're a writer, you're a poet, but you also want to maybe think about getting into that of the other side of the work about education and facilitation. I think part of it mirrors what we were talking about earlier, which is just that idea of finding a way to show up, even if that isn't the whole thing, even if you don't know where it's going to go from there, but finding some doorway, some entry point. And I think some of that could be, a local high school. If you are a student or something, it could be, helping other students organize a weekly poetry club and helping to facilitate that, or joining something that already exists too, whether that is a club at like a college or high school or at a library or something like that. Like finding ways where you're not just on your own thinking about these questions, but you can work with maybe two or three other people to think through these deeper questions. The specific thing about education, it's tricky because like I don't want to be a gatekeeper and say like only certain people can do this, but I also don't think it's necessarily a good thing for everyone who writes poems to suddenly jump out and want to teach kids, because I think teaching and facilitation and like curriculum are skills. We don't just show up, just because you're a brilliant writer, it doesn't mean you can go into a classroom and be a brilliant teacher. Like it's a tricky thing. And so I think some of it is like finding ways to develop those tools, whether that is, again, it depends on where you're at in your life and how old you are and what access you have to different resources. But like, if you are a student, maybe it's about looking into taking classes on curriculum development and pedagogy and that kind of thing. If you're not a student, maybe it's like finding community courses that do that kind of work, or finding a good reading list to read. Like there's a million books that have been written about using hip hop in the classrooms or using poetry, spoken word in the classrooms. I'm just doing some of that research, some of that work. And then, yeah, finding, and I know it's sometimes easier said than done, but finding some kind of entry point, some kind of first step. Maybe it's just volunteering to facilitate a poetry club at the local branch of like the library, or volunteering to show up to a classroom and do a kind of guest speaker thing. Like it's hard, but I think there's also a lot of room for it right now.
Sure. Absolutely, absolutely. It's yeah, working that way up. And I do agree there's definitely a lot of room for it right now. So a lot of folks are definitely looking for that type of education from folks that really want to really are passionate about what they do. So no, thank you so much for sharing all that, Kyle. Now, moving on, you've performed in a lot of different places. Like I said in your intro, United Nations to music festivals around the world. Let's go back a little bit. Performing for the UN, I mean, how does one even get that call? How does one even react to that call? Tell us a little bit about that experience. You performed a poem, correct?
Yeah. Yeah, it goes back to a minute ago, we were talking about the idea of virality and going viral. And I think even though we said that shouldn't necessarily be people's goals or like only goal as a writer, because it doesn't necessarily put you anywhere you're not already at. It just puts your work in front of people's eyes, which isn't a bad thing. Like, I think that's a good thing. But I think back in 2013, 2014, 2015, I had a handful of poems go viral, which, again, for people who, the terminology is a generational thing, right? If you don't know what that means, it just means it's good, gets shared a lot. A lot of people share, a lot of people watch it. It gets passed around in a bunch of different places. And I think the poems of mine that were going viral in that time period were about masculinity, were about gender violence, were about men's roles in kind of feminist work, gender equity work, that kind of thing. And those just got in front of a lot of people, which I think is cool because, it's an important thing for men to be talking about kind of proactively and preemptively. And I think, again, it wasn't that like the Secretary General of the UN saw it and invited me in to address all the world leaders. It was that, I assume it was some kind of like intern or like staffer for, I think it was the Icelandic embassy of Iceland. They were helping to organize a conference at the UN on specifically men's roles in the international gender equity movement. And so it was a bunch of different speakers talking through that question with, a bunch of different leaders and like staffers from UN embassies and stuff, or UN offices. I don't know what you would call them. And so it was kind of a random thing, but just because, again, that being in the right place at the right time, like because I had pieces that were circulating that people knew about, it was a good fit for the specific thing that they were trying to do. Talking again, not just talking about like equity in general, not just talking about gender equity in general, but talking about men's roles in a responsible and intentional way in supporting that work and that movement. And so that's how the invite happened, I guess.
Wow, wow, wow. So having that kind of, what was that kind of feeling like performing on such a large stage like that for you? Did you feel any type of, what was as a poet coming to that type of large stage? How was just the feeling?
Yeah, it was, at the end of the day, like it's almost the event itself was great, but it's a thing that I can again put in my bio for the rest of my life. And like that's really, really valuable to someone who makes a living this way.
Yeah.
Um, then the actual thing was just what I try to say, I think at the thing, and then when it comes up in general, is that I think my being there and performing that poem is actually less about me and like how brilliant my work is, and it's more about how much to go back to that concept of narrative, how much the narrative in this country has shifted, I think, in a real way over the past, you know obviously over the past 50 years, but I think even specifically over the past like 10-15 years. And that's due to the everyday work of like advocates and survivors and people who are doing kind of like, whether that's Title IX work on a college campus or like supporting victim survivors of gender violence, domestic violence, like in community. Like that work happens in a very face-to-face kind of person-to-person way, but also a lot of those same people are also working on these larger ideas of narrative and shifting narratives and moving from like when we talk about like sexual assault, moving from like a no means no frame to a yes means yes frame, and like affirmative consent, like that's shifted so much in the last 15 years. The idea of men taking, again, a more intentional, not going in to like save everyone, not being the leaders necessarily, but just being intentional and hopefully more effective in how we integrate into that work. I don't take any credit for that. I was just happened to have a poem that talked about it, and so I was able to share it. But it's cool. It's again the whole a lot of a major theme in the book that I just put out this past March is the idea of contribution and how much of the work isn't to be the best or to be the most like dominant voice about any particular issue, but just to contribute something that can hopefully be valuable.
Yeah. No, I like how you kind of ended that. Now you frame that, you want people to not necessarily look at themselves as leaders, but just how can you contribute? Because, I'm a firm believer. It's like everyone just has to be the leader of their own life. You know what I mean? You have to just lead your own life. You can't wait for someone to lead you or be led. You have to be the captain of your own ship, which is essentially your own life. And if life can provide that for you, that's kind of the best way to educate yourself and educate the people around you. So no, I definitely vibe with that. We kind of already kind of are hitting on this, but your work as an educator, how do you feel like this is kind of, as an educator of poetry on so many platforms, how do you see that as a jumping off point for folks in real life to have that real dialogue? How do you see, so a better way almost to say is, how do you see your poetry and just poetry in general, just how is that a way for people to jump off into real life conversations to really affect whatever change they need maybe in their life or whatever that looks
Yeah.
like?
Oh, that's a great question. And I like one thing that has come up a couple times in our conversation already is the concept of like critical education or critical pedagogy or like Freirean pedagogy. And we don't have to use all the academic terms, but I think the basic idea is education shouldn't be about me coming into a classroom and like telling everyone what they need to know. Like I don't show up with a PowerPoint presentation that says like, here are the 3 things you need to know about gender equity. Like, and just kind of like drill that into people. It's more about how can we share our stories with each other? How can we both the educator and the students in this space, like how can we have an experience together that we all help shape and that helps further our own understanding of our own experiences, towards liberation. And I think poetry then, and especially spoken word, not just spoken word, but I think especially spoken word, is such a cool tool for that, because it's like when I go into a space and I just share a poem, like it isn't me trying to tell you what to think. It isn't me trying to tell you what to do or give you like the facts or the objective reality that you must believe in. It's just me telling a story. And I think there's so much privilege and opportunity in being like, I'm just telling a story and you can pull from that story what you need to pull from it. But whether you like the poem or don't like the poem, whether you relate to it or don't relate to it, whether it's good or whether it's not good, like that's all to the side. The thing that matters, I think, is the poem becomes an opportunity, a doorway for us to move through into like some deeper discussion. And that's just been a framework that has worked really, really well for me. And then I know I'm not the only one doing that kind of work. Another resource at my website that I've set up is a big list of like 100+ different spoken word videos by a bunch of different artists for use by educators. So like if you're having a unit on, say, consent, here are 10 poems about consent. Or if you're having a unit on white supremacy, here are 10 poems about white supremacy, and like
Wow. Yeah.
just issue by issue.
Yeah. No, that's really what's up. And I think it's so amazing that you have all those resources available on your website, accessible for all to be able to use. So big appreciation for you for doing that for all of the folks out here. So as we're wrapping up, I'm so curious, Kyle, when did you know that you were a writer? Was it a moment in time? Was it a specific place, space? When did you know that you were a writer?
It's another question where I wish I had a more, well, no, I shouldn't say that I wish I do. I think sometimes there's an expectation that there's a really interesting answer or like a lightning strike, like eureka moment where, something happened and then suddenly you're a different person. But I think for me, it very much was just a process, a long process. I can't point to any specific moment. I think, I think it's also good as artists to kind of push back against that idea of like singular moments being the driver of change or growth versus the idea of, again, something we've talked about a lot already, like relationships and cultivating relationships and how that can lead to this gradual growth and development, where it isn't so much about the label of like I am a writer versus the actual work of writing, and like whatever that means to you. Like I want everyone to be able to claim that label, to say like I'm a writer. Like if you write anything, like you're a writer, right? But then I think that again opens up the door to deeper questions about, so what do you want to do with your work? What do you want the work of your work to be in the world? If those are questions people are interested in. So
Absolutely.
yeah.
No, absolutely. It's a long process. There's never just a singular moment. No, I do agree with you. We do need to Yeah, that's an interesting point that you bring about trying to stray away from the idea of there's just one moment where you knew. It's been life is just a accumulation of so many different things happening at once. Everything, everywhere, all at once, and that kind of just forms into who you are and who your being is. So no, I like that a lot. And then, I have one final question for you. We ask every poet this on every episode of the Poet Speaks podcast. Kyle, why do you need to get your words out?
So I think it's a beautiful question. I think another kind of stereotype, and it isn't that it's wrong, but it's just like kind of an expectation or a stereotype of writers and especially poets, is that it's very, very, again, individual, very personal. It's just like I have all this this darkness and this like turmoil inside me, and I need to get it out. And I think that's true for some people. It's true for me to an extent. But as I've gotten older and as I've grown into my own kind of writing life and writing practice, I think more and more and more about something that also that came up earlier in our conversation, which is just how like the world is a mess, right? Like both worldwide, here in this country, here in this state, here in my city, here in my neighborhood, like at every level, the world is a mess. I think with the rise of like authoritarianism and fascism in so many places, it just goes back to that idea of like we have to tell our stories, we have to create, we have to cultivate spaces in which kind of creativity and expression can happen. So again, it isn't just me expressing myself, but it's helping to create spaces where more people can express themselves. I think that work of like, again, people telling their stories, it's easy to think about that as just like a cliche or platitude. Like we have to tell our stories. But I think when you really like get down to it, like that does matter in very specific, powerful ways. When people have spaces like poetry slams or open mics or writing groups or ciphers or whatever to talk, sometimes literally to tell our stories, but sometimes in this bigger sense of like talk through and process the things that we're going through and build bridges between each other and make connections, like that actively resists this like larger kind of authoritarian impulse to everyone just like shut up and go to work and be a productive member of a capitalist society. Like to just continue to push back to that and be weird and be rebellious, however we can. Like that's definitely the main kind of driver of why I continue to do this work.
Absolutely, absolutely. Beautiful, beautiful. Be weird and be rebellious. I love that, everyone. And Kyle, before we wrap up, tell us what's 2022, which is about to end, but what's
Yeah.
the rest of the year for your writing looking like and beyond? And also where can we check out all of your amazing work?
Cool, thank you. Yeah, I released a book back in March called "Not a Lot of Reasons to Sing, but Enough" through Button Poetry. I'm really proud of it. It's like a super, again, weird kind of science fiction, political poetry book. Um, and because of the pandemic, I decided not to do like a formal or traditional kind of book tour. Like I still like go out and do events if someone brings me to their event, but I'm not in a space where I can like organize events and encourage people to come to them. Like I'd rather do virtual stuff. I'd rather, just try to be as safe as possible and, so we can take care of each other. And so what that means is that even though I released a book, I haven't been able to do like a book tour. And so I think instead of, one very intense month where you're playing 100 shows and talking about it all the time, I'm thinking about the release of that book as a kind of a year-long or multi-year process. And so as the new year comes around, I'm going to continue to be doing events to promote that book and to share work from it, virtual stuff and some in-person stuff too, eventually. Going to be kind of doing a lot of, as I look at my calendar here, a lot of residency work this coming year. A few different high schools and middle schools here in Minnesota, and then a few different colleges already scheduled in other states. And then the thing I'm really excited about for this coming year is going back to music. The last like album I released, I think, was in 2018. And so it's been quite a while since I've done music stuff, but I'm working with a couple different producers to specifically do some more like kind of spoken word, like non-rhyming, kind of like slam style, like spoken word stuff with music, which I think obviously people do, but I don't think people do it to the extent that they could, right? Like there's so much room for just more experimentation with how music can relate to the spoken word.
Absolutely, absolutely. And for those that are wondering, I know you dropped your website a couple times. Do you have any Instagram links, Twitter, all that good stuff?
Yeah, so again, main website with all of my work and then all the resources we've been talking about is just guante.info. But then if you search Guante on any social media, at least on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, you'll find me. It's and who knows how long any of those platforms will be usable. I think the one that I'm probably focusing on the most at this point is Instagram, where I'm just Guante solo. But yeah, I'm pretty easy to find on the internet.
That sounds pretty good. All right. Well, everyone, Kyle's links will be down below in the description box of whatever platform you're listening to the Poet Speaks podcast on. Check out the description box for all of Kyle's amazing links. And Kyle, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you so much for being on the Poet Speaks podcast today.
Yeah, thank you for the thoughtful questions.
Absolutely. All right, again, y'all, please go check out all of Kyle's amazing work. And again, this is the Poet Speaks podcast. We'll talk to you soon. Bye, everyone.